Okay, we better get started, I think, just in the interest of time. Maybe about 10 more seconds and then. Good morning, audience. My name is Dr. Nikki Taylor, and I'm a professor of history, African American history at Howard University, and I am the chair for this panel. This panel is entitled The Minister, the Mother, and the Club Woman: The Opportunities and Limits of Kin and Community for African Americans from Emancipation to Jim Crow. Our presenters today are Jessica Wicks-Allen, Stanley Maxson, and Arlisha Norwood, and we have comments from Sarah Lirely. First, Jessica Wicks-Allen will present a paper entitled "They Don't Know the Trouble I've Seen: Freedwomen, Child Care, and Free Labor." She is a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland, a scholar of African American history with particular interest in Black women, slavery, emancipation, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Her dissertation, which is tentatively titled "If I Am Free, My Child Belongs to Me: Black Motherhood and Mothering in the Era of Emancipation," and that dissertation focuses on Black women and motherhood in the United States South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Her research investigates how Black women's status as mothers shaped their transition from slavery to freedom and what emancipation brought to bear on their attitude towards motherhood and practices of mothering. The next presenter after that will be Stanley Maxson, and his paper is entitled "Seek Ye First: Vernacular Information Gathering and African American Struggles for Pensions in Nashville, Tennessee." He is a doctoral candidate at the Department of History at the University of Maryland, College Park. He holds an MA in history from the University of Missouri and specializes in 19th century African American history. His research focuses on the transition from slavery to freedom, space, and place in the post-Civil War U.S. South. He is currently developing a digital history project that constructs the historic working class Nashville neighborhood of Black Bottom through historical research and digital mapping. Followed by Maxson, we'll have Dr. Arlisha Norwood, and her paper is entitled "Lifting This Burden: Unmarried Women, Reform, and the Construction of Black Womanhood." Dr. Norwood is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. She received her PhD in my department at Howard University. Her research focuses on 19th century African American history with an emphasis on slavery, freedom, and Black women. Specifically, her work examines single African American women in the Civil War and post-Civil War era Virginia. She has been awarded several fellowships and a Virginia Humanities Fellowship. She is currently working on a manuscript entitled "To Never Truck with No Man: Single African American Women in the Post-Civil War Virginia." And finally, our comment will be done by Dr. Sarah Lirely, who is an assistant professor of history at Columbia College in Columbia, Missouri. She specializes in 19th century U.S. history, the history of women and gender, and the history of death and death investigations. She has published articles on those topics and has a forthcoming manuscript entitled "An Arc of Death, Suicide, Alcoholism, Murder, Accidents, and Other Early Deaths in St. Louis, Missouri, 1875 to 1885, which will be published by Southern Illinois University Press in 2022. Congratulations, Dr. Lirely. And this project, with its really racy title, will examine 6 different causes of death by interrogating the coroner's verdicts and the community's response. Beautifully done. So without further ado, our first paper will go in order. So it'll be Jessica Wicks-Allen. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for the introduction and for chairing this wonderful panel. And thank you to Dr. Lirely in advance for the comments. I look forward to hearing them. So in the aftermath of the Civil War, freed mothers set out to make a living in hopes of providing better lives for their children. This paper explores how Black mothers fit into the system of free labor in the post-emancipation South, paying particular attention to the childcare strategies they developed to balance work and family life. It shows that to strike this balance, women both drew on strategies they used under slavery and developed new ones. In their efforts to secure supervision for their children during the workday, freed mothers taught their children to work, relied on older children, nurses, schools, hiring out, orphan asylums, and community-based childcare, and when possible, attempted to negotiate childcare provisions as part of their labor contracts. However, owners turned employers who believed children were no longer assets, but encumbrances, ignored Black women's dual responsibilities as mothers and household providers, and freed women struggled to find adequate childcare. For many, leaving small children unattended proved the only viable option. This desperate measure subjected children to harm and death, a devastating reality for freed mothers who were intimately bound to their progeny. Ultimately, the paper shows that the free labor system worked to unmother formerly enslaved women, shedding greater light on the gendered violence endemic to free labor. With emancipation, motherhood was no longer the exclusive right of white women, and as such, freed women hoped to reclaim their reproductive capacity, devote more time to their families, and raise their children on their own terms. Furthermore, they struggled to draw firmer boundaries between their places of work and home lives and demanded that employers recognize that they had families of their own, which they intended to prioritize. In August of 1865, Virginia planter Sally Tabb complained that the freed women on her farm were, quote, occupied solely in taking care of their children, end quote. While some performed light housework, Tabb noted that these tasks were, quote, divided amongst a large number of the mothers, end quote. Dividing the domestic chores lightened the workload for each mother, enabling them all to devote greater time to their children. Their actions make clear that women prioritize motherhood and childbearing over wage labor. Further, to Tabb's dismay, they demanded wages and rations despite their intermittent labor. Even though freed mothers split their time between labor and childcare, they felt entitled to those wages and provisions. While Tabb characterized them as insolent and idle and therefore unworthy of remuneration, freed women rejected such understandings of the economic system and instead espoused a moral economy, one that privileged their responsibilities to family. Newly freed mothers also balanced wage earning and childcare by negotiating Saturdays off, protesting certain work assignments, and refusing to submit to unfair and demeaning labor arrangements that precluded them from caring for their families. Freed mothers' insistence upon prioritizing their own families was appalling to their employers, who continued to conceive of Black women's bodies as instruments of labor for the sole benefit of whites. Employers feared women's domestic obligations would interfere with their ability to perform wage labor and would ultimately upset their bottom lines. As such, white Southerners sought to control every aspect of formerly enslaved people's lives, including their domestic arrangements, to extract as much labor from them as possible and to exercise social control. Consequently, newly emancipated mothers' efforts to attend to their own families were chronically impeded by white employers. Dismissal and other forms of punishment befell mothers who put their children first. Albert Wells ordered Peter Dickinson's wife to, quote, go into the woods and get the rails to put around the cow pen, end quote. She refused, explaining to her employer she could not leave her baby, but volunteered her husband to do the task. Quote, this angered Wells, and he ordered the Dixons to leave, end quote. Mothering responsibilities also cost Sophia Chapman her job. Though Chapman sought permission to visit her daughter for the weekend, upon her return, her employer, quote, told her to go out, that she could not cook no longer for her, end quote. Some employers resorted to outright violence when childcare interfered with their female employees' labor responsibilities. On the morning of December 1st, 1865, Mary Ann Smith was whipped by her former master, Joe Smith, after she got breakfast for her children before watering the hogs. While nursing her child, Josephine Lampkins was ordered to, quote, lay it down and unload a wagon full of corn, end quote. Lampkins disobeyed the order, informing her employer, quote, it was not done sucking, end quote. When Lampkins resolved to feed her baby until it was full, her infuriated employer drew a pistol, shot, and stabbed her. With emancipation, formerly enslaved mothers expected to cut down on the number of hours they toiled to devote more time to their families. Few mothers, however, had the luxury of withdrawing from wage labor, as their wages were critical to their family's survival. Because Black women were relegated to low-wage agricultural and domestic service, making ends meet required them to work from sunup to sundown. A formidable challenge confronting Black mothers was finding childcare for their youngsters. Emancipation brought changes to labor organization and family life that were at odds with the communal childcare strategies Black women had relied on during slavery. Damian Allen Parkus has shown that on large-scale plantations in the Lower South, slaveholders had established proto-nurseries in which elderly slaves and sometimes young girls cared for enslaved children throughout the workday. However, after emancipation, these disappeared, for it no longer behooved former slaveholders to provide daycare for Black workers. While enslaved mothers across the South had been surrounded by grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles, with convicted kin who assisted with childcare responsibilities on plantations, liberal conceptions of the family and the establishment of individual family units in households undermined this community-based form of childcare. Despite these factors, working mothers continued to draw from those near and dear, primarily kin. During the workday, some mothers pooled their resources and divided responsibilities in ways that enabled them to balance work and childcare. Virginia widow Harriet Snyder, for instance, reported to the Freedmen's Bureau that it had been, quote, impossible for her to obtain renewment of employment in Charlottesville, Virginia, on account of her 2 children. Harriet stated that if the Bureau would provide her with transportation to Roanoke, where she could get more steady employment and better wages, her mother-in-law would take care of her children and thus enable her to earn a comfortable living for them all. Harriet also called Roanoke her home and claimed to be well acquainted there. Harriet's rapport with the people in the neighborhood led her to believe that she would be more successful in finding employment in Roanoke and that she could better manage to care for her children with the assistance of her mother-in-law. Mothers also relied on neighbors and community members in both formal and informal ways. As one Northern missionary remarked, quote, I know hundreds who are opening their homes to neglected little ones whose mothers are trying to earn a piece of bread and garment for their children, end quote. Evidence suggests that former slaves also negotiated community-based childcare as part of their labor contracts. Former slaves on a South Carolina plantation, quote, agreed to furnish from our number nurses for children and for the sick, contributing our respective portion of their wages, end quote. 18 of the 33 laborers who signed the contract were female, 8 were male, and the remaining have names that make the gender unclear. The large number of women among the labor force may explain why such provisions were reflected within the contract. Black women were likely integral to the development of these contracts and eager to see childcare negotiated as part of them. When mothers bargained on their own behalf, their maternal needs were forefront and center. A list of regulations on another plantation reveals that the elderly continued to provide childcare for working mothers. It states, quote, the old people will work by minding the poultry, taking care of the infants, which shall be provided with a house and a lot for their accommodation during the absence of their mothers, end quote. While it is unclear how these terms were established, freed people may have bargained for such arrangements to ensure that non-laboring children and elderly ex-slaves were insulated from eviction and adequately cared for. By building such provisions into formal contracts, freed mothers not only ensured that their children would be provided for during the work hours, but that they would have a form of recourse should employers disregard their child care needs. Tara Hunter has shown that washerwomen in Atlanta looked after their neighbors' children who were left at home or in the streets to fend for themselves while their parents worked away. Relying on the watchful eyes of neighbors may have been a greater possibility for women in urban areas. In rural areas, former slaves became more dispersed, living at a distance from one another, forcing many freed women to take on the struggles of motherhood in isolation. Residential patterns and proximity to kin appear to have directly impacted childcare. Given the structural changes to family life and work, more individualized forms of care gained prevalence. Hiring children, for example, was common practice across the South, while mothers saw the economic advantages of such agreements for the entire family. Hiring also served a more immediate practical function. Working mothers could pursue employment without the constant daily challenge of finding childcare. By sending children to work and to live within white households, mothers secured both safety and supervision for their children. The material provisions such arrangements afforded children also explains the use of this childcare strategy. In the wake of her mother's death, former slave Emma J. Ray's father felt compelled to hire his youngsters because he struggled to feed and clothe them. In Ray's autobiography, she recalled that she was, quote, 9 and just old enough to take care of a baby and wash dishes, end quote, when she was hired to a white doctor. When the doctor took her in, Ray had no clothes. The doctor provided her with 2 calico dresses and gingham aprons, of which Ray was very proud. Evelyn Farrell agreed to bind out her son Patrick for the year 1866, so long as he attended school from January 1st to April 1st, was clothed and fed. Annie Burton's mother had secured employment as a cook, and her employer provided her a hut for her and her children to live in. When her mother lost her job, she took in washing by the day for whatever she could, but this proved inadequate for providing for her family. Feeding her children posed a special challenge. For Burton's mother, had sent her and her siblings to get cold victuals from hotels and other places, Burton recalled. Consequently, her mother resolved to send her and her brother to pick cotton, and her sister was hired as a child nurse. Freed people saw these arrangements as a temporary form of childcare that provided their progeny a safe and secure environment and at the same time enabled them to earn a living. As mothers envisioned children's employers as childcare providers, they established expectations about employers' responsibilities and the limits of their authority. When employers used corporal punishment, for instance, mothers promptly intervened and in so doing insisted that disciplining their children was a right reserved strictly for parents. Jane Sockwell, an Arkansas freedwoman, hired her 13-year-old daughter to work as a housekeeper. However, when Sockwell caught wind that her daughter had not only been sent to the fields, but whipped when she proved unable to keep up, Jane considered the contract null and void and went to retrieve her daughter, despite the employer's insistence that he be allowed to, quote, keep the child as long as he wanted and whip it as often as he pleased, end quote. The division between work and childcare was not always absolute. Some mothers took their children to work with them. Nate Shaw recalled that when his stepmother went to chop cotton for the white folks, she would usually take him along. Quote, my stepmother wanted my company, but she also wanted me to see me eat 2 good meals, end quote, he recalled. Without the constant oversight of employers to regulate their daily routines, sharecropping mothers also totted their infants and small children to the fields. When possible, mothers assigned their small children minor chores such as water totting and picking cotton, which both kept children occupied and alleviated some of their mother's workload. Such arrangements were ideal for women with infants because they could nurse them throughout the day. In doing so, freed mothers avoided introducing harmful food substitutes like cow's milk and alternative feeding methods that compromise infant health. Prolonging breastfeeding made possible by this childcare strategy worked to fend off health-threatening conditions. Nursing children may have also been a means by which mothers prolonged their infertile period to space out the births of their children. Combining wage labor and childcare day in and day out was undoubtedly exhausting, but it afforded mothers peace of mind because they could personally keep an eye on and spend more time with their youngsters. Families sometimes put their wages toward hiring nurses to look after their children. A Florida man hired his niece to look after his children, quote, while his wife worked in the field, end quote. Kentucky freedwoman Emancipation hired a Black woman to look after the youngest of her 3 children, paying her $5 a month. The fact that some families directed a portion of their earnings toward childcare reflects the importance some families placed on reliable care. Such arrangements mutually benefited mothers and childminders. On one hand, working parents could make a living with the peace of mind that their children were supervised by caregivers whom they had known and personally vetted and trusted. On the other hand, child nurses received wages or supplemental income. Further,
30 seconds.
childminders who worked for Black families escaped the demeaning conditions that often came with working for whites and could devote more time to their own families. Paid childcare, however, appears to have been out of the reach for most mothers due to their wages. So I have much more to say about this, but I've run out of time. My paper goes on to talk a little bit about how Freedwomen envision schools as sites of childcare, but ultimately the point of the paper is to show the particular challenges that Black mothers face under free labor, and that the lack of childcare options that they had being hindered under the system of free labor inflicted a particular form of violence on Black women. And so I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about some of the examples that I didn't get to, but thank you for my time.
I'm sorry, but that was a fascinating paper. So next we'll hear from Stanley Maxson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for chairing the panel, and thank you, Dr. Lirely, for providing comments, and Jessica and Arlisha for being co-panelists on this. I'm really excited to be a part of it. I had a quick question, sort of administrative one. It looked like before starting the recording, I could share my screen. I was going to have a presentation, but now it's gone away.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. And I'm not sure how to get it back.
Okay, that's fine. I am just going to share the link to the presentation, excuse me, in the chat. For everyone that's on the right hand of your panel, you should be able to open the chat there. I'm going to drop the link to my presentation, and you should be able to follow along at your own pace. In the fall of 1899, Richard Blanton, a Black minister in Nashville, Tennessee, and Joseph Kellogg, a white former police officer, hiked up St. Cloud Hill together in the dead of night, purportedly to hunt for gold. Neither man had a lamp to light the way. Blanton told Kellogg that the gold would disappear if they made a noise while approaching, and it would sink further underground if they were making noise in its presence. The location of the gold would be, quote, marked by some kind of jack-o'-lantern on the hill. As they ascended the hill, which was crowned by the remnants of Fort Negley, shown in the first picture on the page, and overlooked by the Nashville City Cemetery, Kellogg followed Blanton's instructions, eager to find the promised gold. From the top of the hill, they looked out over the city, which was lit by the glow and glimmer of electric lighting. St. Cloud Hill was the tallest hill in Nashville, second only to the cupola of the state capitol, a half a mile to the north. As they approached Fort Negley, Blanton's instructions to his white associate were an inversion of Nashville's racial past. From August of 1862 to April of 63, more than 2,700 formerly enslaved men climbed the hill and labored to construct the fortifications of Fort Negley. In 1863, Blanton himself, a refugee from slavery, had been on the receiving end of instructions of how to apply a shovel and hoe to the earth and rock of St. Cloud Hill. Indeed, when confronted with an account of his trip up the hill, Blanton claimed that he never again applied a shovel to the earth. Perhaps Blanton's familiarity with the site led him to deny digging with Kellogg. Perhaps Blanton did not wish to disturb the hallowed ground where so many friends and acquaintances had labored, fought, and died for freedom. The Civil War disturbed the earth. Seeking gold among the unmarked burial plots of Black soldiers, whose names were unrecorded in the ledger books of the Union Army, may have deterred Blanton from once again lifting a shovel on the hill. Perhaps he simply wanted to avoid the association with grave robbing by digging in the earth where so many had died and were buried, were disinterred and reinterred. If there was digging to be done on St. Cloud Hill in 1899, Blanton expected Kellogg to pick up the shovel. It's worth taking seriously the account of these jack-o'-lanterns and disappearing gold for what it suggests about Blanton's methods of information gathering. Blanton and Kellogg's hike up the hill, fanciful as it may seem, was a journey of discovery. Improbable as they sound, Blanton's practices were neither random nor illogical. They were vernacular. Blanton developed the tools he needed to read the terrain of St. Cloud Hill, translate it into meaningful information for locating something of value, in this case, hidden gold. Searching for a spook light or an orb of light with no known source under the midnight sky, approaching disappearing gold with silence and care, were tools of discovery legible only to Blanton. He sought the gold on his own terms. This paper follows the path of Blanton as he walked the streets of late 19th century Nashville, once again seeking information, though this time of a different sort. Blanton was a pension claims agent who represented poor African Americans in their struggles to gain pensions for Civil War widows and soldiers. Blanton walked to gather vernacular knowledge from community and acquaintances. He organized this information in his own means and offered many who had found their claims rejected a last hope of securing federal entitlement. Joining a historiography of African American interaction with the U.S. Pension Bureau, this paper argues that Civil War pension system, while national in scope, was shaped by highly local relationships and contingencies. It does so by walking with Blanton and reconstructing a day in his life from the sparse historical record of his work. Blanton left no diary, no daily routine, but information of his practice is scattered throughout his own pension application, the records of the Pension Bureau's investigations into his work, and criminal court proceedings for his trial of alleged violation of pension law. The Pension Bureau began accepting eyewitness testimony as legal proof as far back as 1864. In doing so, the Bureau attempted to establish a legal framework for legitimizing vernacular information. That is, information only accessible through people. And people, by virtue of the upheaval of the Civil War and urbanization of the New South era, were very often distant from one another. For example, when Blanton met one widow, Melvina Patton, to get information on her marriage during slavery, he was invited inside her house to her kitchen. To identify a person who could attest to her pre-war marriage, Patton had to recall the name of a man she knew prior to emancipation and had not seen since the war and her migration to Nashville. But he was the only one who could verify that she was married to a soldier under slavery. The pension application files of African Americans are filled with this type of vernacular information, and as such, they provide a lens into Black life in the late 19th century, narrated largely for and by Black people. Historians that have engaged African Americans' history with the Pension Bureau have shown that African American pension claims face prejudiced application processes based on race, gender, sexuality, age, and the ability to conform to the norms of respectability as defined by white male Bureau agents. This paper argues that there was also a geography to Black pension claims that should not be overlooked. If we pause for a moment and reflect on the mechanisms of African American claims, the vernacular process by which eyewitness testimony was gathered from current and former acquaintances, geographical distance becomes a salient category by which applications were both made and adjudicated. Because of the geography of a pension, both the Bureau and Black applicants developed competing information practices to serve their own needs. Black pension applicants relied on the ability to draw on relationships past and present, near and far. Black claims agents like Richard Blanton in Nashville were essential in fulfilling this role. Blanton and other private claims agents developed a deep knowledge of the social relationships of their clients to connect them with potential witnesses. I argue that Black claims agents tapped into a vernacular archive, a rich tapestry of personal histories and relationships to connect applicants to witnesses and to weave social relationships into federal entitlements. As a facilitator between poor African Americans and the Pension Bureau, this required more than just the transposition of information from community to bureaucracy. For Blanton, it required movement. His work was the application of feet to street. His office was the homes of his clients, their front porches and kitchens. He met people where they were, waiting for a train station or in a tavern. As a minister and a claims agent, his work was ecumenical. It was therefore as a local Nashvilleian that Blanton would have left his wood frame house at 1104 Church Street on the fall morning and stepped into the busy thoroughfare to be greeted by his neighbors and clients alike. This home is located on the map and the link that I put in the chat. He was accustomed to the noise of the streetcars that ran the length of the roadway, and walking in the direction of Broad Street, Blanton heard the voice of Melvina McMurray, a Black housewife who hailed him from her front porch. After greeting one another, McMurray introduced Blanton to George Moore, who was seeking back pay for the services of a Union captain. McMurray had been trying to connect Blanton and Moore for some time after she had learned that Moore had, quote, been a waterman for the Union Army. This work was during the Civil War, but he had never received a pension or back pay. She told Moore about Blanton, quote, a man who worked up pensions for people and gets pay due them from the government. This morning, McMurray succeeded in bringing the two together on her front porch. Blanton listened to Moore and discussed options for a pension and possible back pay. After learning that he had in fact been a cook for the 72nd Indiana Infantry, Blanton escorted him to the home office of his notary public. Asking their leave of McMurray, Blanton and Moore walked south to 311 Summer Street to, quote, have his application filled out. Walking for Blanton was a means and a method. Blanton moved from point A to point B by walking, but more importantly, walking enabled Blanton to meet with his clients and solicit business from new acquaintances. One such acquaintance was Tisla Smith, who he met as he passed through Keegan's Alley, a back alley sided by tenements, on his way to Broad and the office of his notary. Quote, my husband and I were standing on our front porch, Smith recounted, and, quote, Mr. Blanton was passing by and my husband spoke to him. Blanton's visibility in the neighborhood made him approachable, a source of knowledge about pension applications that was not otherwise available to the Smiths. Blanton's movement unlocked the possibility that the Smiths could learn something about the Pension Bureau and receive a federal entitlement. Unlike the Black attorneys of Nashville, Blanton did not have an office of his own to conduct business in. And perhaps more importantly, Blanton was not an aspiring member of the Nashville Black elite, and therefore may have seemed more approachable to some of the working poor. Blanton conducted his business on the streets. Many of Blanton's clients came to him frustrated by unsuccessful and expensive attempts to secure a pension with a licensed attorney. Blanton's clients could talk to him, and he would listen and assured him that their business was being taken care of and tended to. For poor Black Americans who worked with Blanton, his practice of browsing neighborhoods transposed this vernacular information into the bureaucratic language of the pension system. And a significant part of that role was traversing distance, moving from house to house, to the notary, to the post office. Blanton also used Nashville's public spaces for vernacular information gathering. Along with the private homes and businesses, Blanton transformed public spaces such as streets, railroad depots, and public squares into locations of research and outreach. For example, he met Belle Henderson and her husband at the railway station during their visit to Nashville for the Centennial Exposition. He simply approached the couple and asked if they, quote, knew any people that was killed in the times of war. Henderson and her husband said yes. Belle Henderson explained that her father had died in the war, but she had not pursued a pension because, quote, it had been so long and I could not tell enough to give satisfaction. Blanton assured her that there was a possibility and that the inquiry was worth her time, saying, quote, I will go to work and find out what was needed. Blanton encouraged the couple to accompany him to his house, where they discussed the details of a potential pension application before he escorted them to Kellogg's house, his notary. Blanton also frequented public markets that, like the public space of the railway, functioned as gathering places for day laborers, hack drivers, and draymen. Nashville had 2 open-air markets. After visiting Kellogg's house, Blanton would have certainly walked past one, the Haymarket also pictured on the map. This sat adjacent to Kellogg's home. Unlike Court Square in the north, which was busiest on market days, the Haymarket was always open and primarily used for the wholesale sale of staple crops and livestock. In addition to being a site of commerce, day laborers would gather at the market square and sell their labor for daily contracts. In 1890, over 3/4
1 minute,
of black
Stanley.
women, I'm sorry?
1 minute.
Thank you. Had been working, 3/4 of black men working in Nashville were unskilled laborers. And the Haymarket was a natural place to make acquaintances and develop clientele. The last example comes from the Nashville National Cemetery, which you can see located on the map. Blanton would go to the Nashville Cemetery to read the names of listed on gravestones of deceased black veterans. He would visit the cemetery, read their names and their unit, and then go back to Nashville, where he would search for people with a similar name. He would also use this after meeting acquaintances like Tisla Smith, who knew that their father had fought in the war and died, but didn't know what service they had given. So he would go to the Union Army cemetery, look for their names, and possibly a record of their service. The cemetery therefore functioned as a resource, an official record to Blanton that he could visit, that was not narrated or controlled by the Bureau of Pensions itself. He could get the information on his own terms, on his own time. And therefore, the city cemetery and other public space was transformed into a vernacular archive for Richard Blanton. I'd like to answer any questions you have during the question and answer period. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stanley. Next up, we'll have Dr. Norwood.
Hello, you all. Good morning. I apologize for being late. I just had some technical difficulties. Good morning, Dr. Taylor, Jessica, Stan, Dr. Lirely. My paper, Lifting This Burden, Unmarried Women Reform and Construction of Black Womanhood, in the Construction of Black Womanhood. I don't think I had my coffee this morning, so please work with me, please. On June 15th, 1895, 21-year-old Pokey Barnes was arrested for the murder of Lucy Pollard. Pollard, a white resident of Lunenburg County, Virginia, had been brutally attacked with an axe and robbed of nearly $800. As soon as Pollard's husband discovered her body, neighbors began to speculate about the murderer. Those who lived near the farm were questioned first. Pokey Barnes, a young African-American woman, was interrogated with 6 other Black women who resided on and around the Pollard's land. Her mother, Mary Barnes, her younger sister, Rena Barnes, and her neighbor, Mary Abernathy, were all taken in. The women claimed they were innocent. Moreover, they all had alibis. With little to no evidence tying them to the murder, Lunenburg officials made plans to release the women. But before they were released, investigators wanted to question one more suspect, Solomon Marable. Solomon Marable evaded the authorities for nearly 2 days. When he was finally caught, he was attempting to board a train to California. Immediately, the trip attracted suspicion. Investigators were anxious to hear Marable's side of the story, and his interrogation would point them in a new direction. Only an hour after being taken in, Marable confessed to the crime. He also implicated Mary Barnes, Pokey Barnes, and Mary Abernathy. He alleged Pokey Barnes and Mary Abernathy had helped him in the murder, while Mary Barnes assisted with the planning of the crime. The news of Marable's confession and accusations spread like wildfire throughout the county, and calls for a lynching soon followed the flame. In the late 19th century, Southern African Americans charged with violent crimes against white men or women faced not only dread of imprisonment or death, but also the possibility of mob violence. In Barnes' case, Lunenburg officials hoped to ward off lynching. The police appealed to the governor for more protection, and as a deterrent to the growing mob, authorities frequently moved the suspects around, keeping their location secret. In July, after county pleas, the governor finally sent at least 2 white regiments to protect the prisoners. A few days later, the trial started. Marable, Pokey Barnes, and Mary Abernathy all faced the charge of first-degree murder. an accusation that carried the sentence of death. However, Mary Barnes was charged with second-degree murder. If found guilty, she faced up to 10 years. Not one of the defendants was able to secure counsel, and none of them knew how to read or write. The state was required to provide them with counsel, but no attorney was willing to take the case. Therefore, the women and Solomon Marable were left to defend themselves. Marable faced the jury first. His trial lasted 2 days. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Mary Abernathy's trial lasted a bit longer, but ended with the same result, guilty. By the time the docket reached Pokey Barnes, many expected the same chain of events. However, Barnes refused to go down without a fight. By 1895, Pocahontas Pokey Barnes had suffered through a lifetime of events. At the time of her trial, Barnes was a young widowed mother. Her husband had been killed in a train accident. As a widow, she took in laundry and did other odd jobs for money. In most cases, as a young widow, Barnes would have gained the sympathy from her community members. Instead, residents expressed disdain for Barnes and her lifestyle choices. Many testified that she openly lived with a man whom she was not married to. Living with the man represented an affront to late 19th century middle-class African-American norms. It wasn't just that Barnes lived with the man, but when questioned about her relationship status, she outright refused to remarry. Barnes' unmarried status and her refusal to accept community norms may have impacted how she was viewed. Black residents who lived around the Pollard farm testified that she came from a troubled family and that she had been in several disputes with the many, including the victim, Lucy Pollard. Given her past behavior, community members did not rush to defend her, but her family and friends did. Witnesses recalled that on the day of the murder, Barnes had been running a few errands, but for most of the day, she had been inside. During the exact time of the murder, she was playing with her daughter. Her daughter was called to the stand and confirmed this story. Despite this strong alibi and various testimonies, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. At the trials and convictions, Marable, Pokey Barnes, and others, after the trials and convictions, Marable, Pokey Barnes, and others were transported to Richmond. Once they arrived in the city, the case took another turn. Solomon Marable began to change his story. He confessed that he was solely responsible for the murder and the women had not helped him in any way. His accomplice had been a white man who was now on the run. This news shocked Virginians. Since the Poland murder broke, Virginia newspapers had been consistently covering the trials. The widely read white newspaper, the Richmond Dispatch, provided readers with almost daily updates, and the African-American newspaper, the Richmond Planet, covered the trial with the same fervor. The Planet was the brainchild of John Mitchell Jr., a staunch Black activist who used his journalism skills to decry racism, segregation, and lynching. From the beginning, Mitchell proclaimed the women's innocence. However, it was Pokey Barnes who captured his attention. Throughout the trial, Mitchell worked to change public opinion surrounding Barnes. While white newspapers like the Dispatch set out to convey her as a violent, immoral woman living in sin with the man, Mitchell asserted her morality. The Planet dedicated a front-page spread to her testimony. In the article, the editor praised her for a remarkable presence in her trial. Mitchell also used the Richmond Planet to physically change the image of Barnes. In 1895, the Richmond Dispatch published an illustration of Barnes in front of the state penitentiary. In the picture, she is wearing a tattered and old clothing. In another photograph that circulated, Barnes appeared next to Mary Abernathy. Again, her clothing was tattered. But in an 1895 issue of the Richmond Planet, Barnes appeared on the front page in a large gown, standing resolutely. The caption read, "Pokey Barnes as she is today." Mitchell's agenda to change Barnes' image worked. The case gained support from middle-class and elite Black Virginians. Black women financially supported her. In 1896, the Alexandria Gazette reported that Barnes and Mitchell made an appearance at First Baptist Church. They collected nearly $23 from the enthusiastic crowd. The Women's Richmond League later recalled that Barnes' case had been the impetus behind the creation of the organization. Despite the positive public support and confession from Solomon Marable, Barnes narrowly escaped execution. In 1896, after several mistrials and a ruling by the Virginia Supreme Court, Pokey Barnes was finally acquitted. After her acquittal, the Bedford Democrat, another Virginia newspaper, noted that Barnes was residing in Jackson Ward, a prominent Black neighborhood in Richmond. The reporter revealed that she was being recruited to support competing factions of the Negro Republican Party. Barnes' popularity with Black Virginians was in large part due to Richmond Planet's coverage and John Mitchell's advocacy. By changing the image and perception of Barnes, he helped move her and her case beyond the ill reputation into the Black Richmond Social Center. Mitchell was not the only one paying attention to the lives of unmarried Black women like Barnes. This paper argues that in the late 19th and early 20th century, unmarried African American women were at the center of Virginia's post-Reconstruction reform agenda. Black reformers discussed the future of these women in detail. As illustrated in Barnes' story, unmarried women often face harsh community condemnation. Black middle class and elite communities saw unmarried women as a blight on the path to racial elevation. This disdain for unmarried women was coupled with protection. Many middle class Black women saw themselves as redeemers in the lives of single Black women. As a result, in the early 20th century, Black women created organizations, institutions, and agendas that worked to safeguard unmarried women against danger. During the 1899 Hampton Negro Conference, Lucy Laney, a notable reformer from Georgia, gave remarks on the burden of the educated Negro woman. Laney considered the chief responsibility of the educated African American woman to be immorality, which was rooted in the disregard of the marriage vow. Laney, like many other reformers, believed it was a job of educated colored women to help the Black community lift this burden of ignorance. At the turn of the century, middle-class African Americans formed communities of moral-minded educators and reformers who aimed to change the path of Black women and girls throughout the South. Laney had already successfully used her methods of reforming education in her home state of Georgia. Her presentation in Virginia was meant to impart her expertise and advice to Black Virginians who were interested in decreasing the single Black women population. The Black reform community in Virginia accepted Laney's charge with enthusiasm and vowed to come to the rescue of a morally depleted population who they believed needed their help. They communicated to all that marriage was central to the reform agenda and women were expected to marry. Refusal to marry would lead to community reproach. In addition to community dismissal, Black reformers and activists like Laney worked to construct an idea of Black womanhood that not only rejected singlehood as respectable status, but they also worked to steer young women away from the perceived sexual immorality that came with being single. The Black Virginia reform community emerged amidst a chaotic political environment. The years following Reconstruction were marked with significant political shift that created a short-lived but impactful alliance between Black Virginians and white Virginians. Black Virginians and white Virginians briefly coalesced around the issue of readjusting the state's pre-Civil War debt. For years, the Readjuster Party rose to power, sending at least 2 senators to Congress and electing a state governor. The party posed a dangerous threat to former Confederates who desired to reestablish rule. Aware of the consequences of an interracial coalition, conservatives and opponents of the Readjuster Party organized as a Democratic Party. By 1883, the Democrats managed to regain power and defeat the Readjuster candidates at the ballot box. This successful takeover was largely due in part to Readjusters' internal dispute about marriage. For most of 1882 and 1883, Virginian Democrats provoked fears of miscegenation using interracial marriage. Since the start of the Readjuster Party, Black Readjusters had worked to challenge the interracial marriage ban. Black readjusters called for full access to the marital contract. Historian Jane Daly argues that Black Southerners use marriage to signify their new identity as co-equals. This is evident in African Americans' interest in the institution of marriages and their scrutiny of those who were not protected under the contract. If Black Virginians saw marriage as a signifier of equality, they viewed those who did not treat the unions with esteem as detrimental to their new positions as equals. Given its importance to rights from 1870 to 1900, Black Virginians included marriage in a broader moral reform effort that addressed Black women and racial elevation. The primary goal of racial elevation was to make African Americans respectable for their eyes and for the eyes of whites. Elevation ideology included an emphasis on education and religion. The post-Civil War years saw an increase in local and national reform organizations that focused on racial elevation. While reformers were concerned with how they were perceived and believed a positive perception could result in better treatment from whites, others displayed a genuine concern for the future of the race. Notwithstanding the ideological differences, both schools of thought believed Black women played a crucial role in racial elevation and racial uplift. Black women were expected to establish morals and work to alter the lives of morally depraved Black reformers. Black reformers not only looked to women to do the organizational labor of moral reform, but they also aimed to construct a new image of Black womanhood to hold up as a standard. I am going to skip ahead because I have about 2 minutes left, and I want you all to hear some other cases of single Black women. If I can find one in this very long paper. So I will just sum it up. The paper goes on to talk about how single Black women were excluded from the new image of Black womanhood, and instead they were offered as a route that not only Black women should stay away from, but adolescent young Black girls. This was included in the reform agenda centering criminality and delinquency. And so eventually a reform school is opened up that releases the adolescent girls if they are married. Middle-class Black reformers also, again, as I stated earlier, gathered around to protect unmarried women. And so I talk about how they created a medium for unmarried Black women who traveled to the North to get jobs. They created a medium through the Hampton newspaper to acquire labor for the women or connect the unmarried Black women with women who needed labor so that they were safe. And that is where I end. I would love to answer any questions in the chat about my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Norwood. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Lirely. I believe I pronounced her last name wrong the first time. It's Lirely.
Oh, no, you had it right the first time. It's Lirely.
Okay. Lirely. Okay.
It's not spelled that way.
Okay. So she will give a comment now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to comment. I'll make some overall comments about the papers as a whole and then individually, and I'll raise questions for each author that they can address at the end if you want to, or just to think about. I have to say I really enjoyed these papers. I learned a great deal from them, and actually I've already shared some of the findings with my students. Yesterday I was talking briefly about some of the things in Emancipation, so thank you for that. These three papers emphasize that emancipation was far from a simple, clean process, but one that was complex, challenging, and exhausting. After the Civil War ended, newly freed people had to balance work and motherhood, provide evidence to the government that they deserved Civil War pensions that they or their spouses had earned, and for unmarried Black women, balance their own interests with those of reformers. At times, Black men and women faced challenges from white authorities, such as employers, government agencies, while at other times they faced challenges from other Black men and women, notably reformers who sought to uplift them. These papers highlight that individuals, groups, and agencies often had competing agendas. Wicks-Allen, Maxson, and Norwood, all three highlight the limits and opportunities that African Americans experienced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And even with presented with what seemed like opportunities, they often had to overcome obstacles to access them, sometimes from their own community. So thinking about Wicks-Allen's paper, it is well known that when freed after the Civil War, many Black women chose to focus on caring for their families, often retreating from the fields according to white observers. But as Wicks-Allen points out, most also had to engage in paid labor as well. She compellingly argues that because newly freed women had to care for their children and engaged in paid work after the Civil War, quote, the free labor system worked to unmother formerly enslaved women, shedding greater light on the gendered violence endemic to free labor. Wicks-Allen makes a number of points to support her argument, relying on letters, court records, and labor contracts. Black women prioritized their families. They shared childcare and housekeeping duties with other women and demanded having time off, such as Saturdays. Their actions put them in conflict with their employers, however, who believed that they had a right to their labor just as they had before emancipation. And some even resorted to violence to prove their point. Black women found a variety of solutions to the dilemma of childcare, relying on relatives as they had when enslaved, hiring their children out, bringing their children to work, sending them to school, which I got to read about, but we didn't get to hear about today, or leaving them at home without supervision. It was younger children who were often left unsupervised, and also these younger children who suffered the most injuries and deaths. She notes that the historical record has no account of the mother's reaction, but speculates that they likely felt, quote, grief, anguish, regret, and frustration. Wicks-Allen work raises several questions, many of which your work may not be able to answer. But I would like to know, were these dilemmas of balancing employment and childcare resolved? And if so, how? For example, did compulsory education play a role in alleviating the burden of childcare? Did fair employment policies later on or mothers' pensions help Black women? And a more difficult question to answer, but one that I'm curious about, is what happened to these children as they got older and their mothers? And my guess is the historical record is silent or nearly silent on that point. But I was reading this wondering just what became of these people. So next is Stan Maxson's paper. Like Wicks-Allen, Maxson also points out how complicated and difficult the emancipation process could be. Using court records, geographical records, and pensions, Maxson examines newly freed people's efforts to secure Civil War pensions and widows' pensions through the experiences of Richard Blanton, a pensions claims agent who represented poor African Americans. Maxson follows Blanton through the streets of Nashville in his paper. He convincingly argues that Black claims agents such as Blanton, quote, tapped into a vernacular archive, a rich tapestry of personal histories and relationships to connect applicants to witness and weave social relationships into federal entitlements. As opposed to official records or documents, Blanton and other claims agents collected eyewitness testimony, which the Pension Bureau began to accept as legal proof in 1864. Maxson notes that, quote, the Pension Bureau and Black applicants developed competing information practices to serve their own needs. Blanton walked across Nashville into spaces public and private to gather information to help poor Black families receive their pensions. He traveled to homes, public squares, businesses, railroad depots, and even cemeteries to collect the evidence that the Pension Bureau wanted. But Blanton had a personal motivation as well as a professional one to motivate him to do this difficult work. He knew that, in Maxson's words, the rational universalist processes of the bureaucratic archive were not sufficient for the claims of his clients from his own experience, having had his own pension application rejected multiple times between 1886 and 1906. So questions for Stan. Again, I'm curious as to what happened to Blanton and the families that he helped. Did his work create a model for other pension claims agents? Did his methods differ from other claims agents? And if so, how? And how did his employer respond to his work? Because he's really kind of creating a new method here, which I found really fascinating. And then last but not least is Arlisha Norwood's paper. Finally, we learn that these struggles of emancipation extended beyond the Reconstruction era in this paper. Norwood argues that, quote, in the late 19th and early 20th century, unmarried women like Pokey Barnes were at the center of reform agendas, not only to reform or uplift these women, she points out, but also to protect them. As historians well know, the progressive era was one in which women reformers in particular sought to protect and uplift others, including unmarried women, but unmarried Black women, Norwood points out, were central to efforts for racial uplift as well. She relies on government documents, club reports, and period journals and newspapers to support these claims. She begins with the story of a murder and the lone defendant who contested murder charges against her, and she uses this case to introduce the reform efforts of middle-class Black women, as well as the political landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which again, we just got to hear a bit about, but I was fortunate I got to read about all of that in the paper. She explains the idea of racial uplift as a desire for, quote, moral reform. Class was central to these efforts, she notes. Ultimately, in part because of the help of Black women reformers, Barnes was acquitted after a fascinating series of other events that changed the outcome of the trial. That was a fascinating story to hear about Pokey Barnes. Norwood points out that Black reformers centered particularly on the home. And while this may sound similar to white reformers, it has an important difference because Black reformers saw the home not only as the center of the family, but a place where, quote, Black women could express the importance of freedom and womanhood. Reformers emphasized the importance of cleanliness, cooking, and other aspects of housekeeping. But as we heard about, unmarried Black women posed a problem for reformers. They did not have so-called proper homes to keep, and the paper talks about how it contributed to a high infant mortality rate, or this was the argument anyway, by not marrying and properly caring for children. They also sought to reform wayward adolescent women, which we got to hear a little bit about. Given the political climate of the time, when white supremacy resurfaced in Redeemer governments, Black reformers did not want to give legitimacy to their claims that African Americans were inferior, including as inferior mothers, homemakers, or individuals who seemed to shun, or did shun, the institution of marriage and motherhood. One point stood out to me from your conclusion, from Norwood's conclusion, and that is that, quote, for years, single Black women encountered reproach from white government officials and religious organizations. However, by the end of the 19th century, their toughest adversary seemed to be members in their community, which I thought was an interesting tension. So questions for Arlisha Norwood. At the beginning of the paper, we are introduced to that stunning murder case that ultimately, and surprisingly to me anyway, resulted in the acquittal of Pokey Barnes. What happened to Pokey Barnes? Is it possible to know? And I would also like to know how exactly Black reformers worked to change the image of unmarried Black women in that case and others to change public opinion, in addition to altering her literal image via clothing and presentation. And I got to see a really lovely photo in the paper that kind of illustrated how they literally changed her image. And how is that related to discussion of reformers throughout the paper? So I will leave, if you would like to respond to my questions, you're welcome to. If you just want to think about those, I understand that. But thank you they were really such a pleasure to read. So thank you. And I enjoyed listening to you all read them.
Thank you, Dr. Lirely. So let's have responses in the order that she asked the questions.
So I'll hop in here and say that, Dr. Lirely, to one of your questions, you asked, is this a problem that gets alleviated eventually, and with compulsory education and perhaps other reform? And I think the answer is not until the 20th century, if at all. So I found evidence in the 1896 Atlanta conference in which African Americans met to discuss problems that were plaguing African American communities. At that conference, one of the major issues that's being discussed is infant mortality. And this question of Black women's labor and their inability to devote adequate time to their families is a central concern talked about amongst African Americans there. And they cite these numerous examples in which children are dying in household fires and are dying due to these accidents and mishaps that happen in the absence of their mothers when they're out working all day. So I guess the answer to your question is no, right? Because it remains this widespread problem, and I would argue is a result of Black women's inability to adequately juggle those two things, having to work all day long without adequate childcare. So that answers part of your answer. But I think you're also speaking to another challenge that I run up against in my own work, the challenge of not having the source material to answer a lot of these questions about what becomes of my historical subjects. But I appreciate your questions and really appreciated your comments. Thank you for taking the time to read my work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lirely, for those wonderful comments and summaries of the papers. It's always useful to hear your own work sort of captured and given back to you. It gives me some clarity, so I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And your wonderful question as well, which I think I'll try and answer here, particularly about was Blanton's methods a model for other Black folks seeking pension, and particularly Black claims agents. So I think a model I'm not sure of, but is it something that other people were doing? Almost certainly, and particularly the work of Brandy Brimmer points to that as well. In her book, she writes about Frederick Douglass, who was a Black attorney and knew a different Frederick Douglass, right, than the one that we hear about so frequently. But this Frederick Douglass was a Black attorney in New Bern, North Carolina, who did a lot of work in the Black community there for folks seeking pensions. Richard Blanton was not an attorney, right? He was self-educated, probably educated during his time spent in the Union Army during the Civil War. He could read and write, but he did not have a law degree, and neither did he officially have authority to practice before the Bureau of Pensions, right? That was an honor that you had to apply for and receive permission from the Bureau. He was not a licensed notary either. So he is this a working class poor veteran. He's an itinerant minister in Nashville, and he is doing this on the side. And from what we can gather from the historical record, he's not doing it for money either, because this process could take. There was a burden, right, of cash up front. Every letter you sent to the Bureau, every piece of paperwork had a small postal fee that you had to send out. And when you serviced over 100 clients, like Richard Blanton did, clients who could not afford attorney fees or possibly even postage, that burden would fall on Blanton, and he would hope for payment after a pension would come through. So he's servicing a working class population that many of whom have tried to receive a pension before from a licensed attorney and had their claims rejected. And after they've been rejected over a number of years, this is also something that comes up in Brandy Brimmer's work, or really anyone who writes about Black pension claims. It takes years of constant application, providing evidence over evidence to receive the entitlements that they are due, right? Another thing that, to your question of what happened to him, well, he gets in a lot of trouble, essentially. And this is another reason why the Black attorneys in Nashville probably did not want to take the cases that Blanton is assisting. One, there's the money question, but second, they could get into trouble with the Pension Bureau and be disbarred from applying for pensions in the future. And in the case of Blanton, there's potential criminal charges if they find that the pensions that they are applying are false or fraudulent. So Blanton is tapping into, he chooses to believe the community, the people in which he's filing for pensions for, the Bureau, who wants this monopoly of information, an authority of information, which I refer to as this bureaucratic archive, right? That they want to confirm all of the information, right? They can talk with the Department of War, right? And they can verify that a person was a soldier, that they died on this date, that this was their name when they enlisted. And Blanton is trying to get all that information from the people around him. And the Bureau eventually, particularly his visits to the cemetery, the Bureau accuses him of filing false information and using information that is not from their records, right? Not the official war records. And they accuse him of going to the cemetery to drum up false claims, right? To say that he's gathering names from the cemetery, going back and saying, hey, I know this person is a dead soldier. He's your neighbor, right? He's your father, right? And so there's a large trial in 1899. Both Kellogg and Blanton are convicted and sent to prison for 3 years. And so this, in terms of the model of success, I'm not sure it features it's a model of success. As an example of how challenging it was for African Americans to receive the entitlements that they were due, I think it's a resounding example of the challenges of particularly working class Black applicants.
Thank you. I had no idea.
Hi, Dr. Lirely, and thank you for reading my paper. I really enjoyed your comments. Like Stan said, we often write in isolation, really a pandemic, and and it was good to hear that, maybe something hit, some points it did hit. So Pokey Barnes eventually, again, as I said in the paper, she moved to Jackson Ward. She lived a very, very rich life. She did remarry, which is interesting. Her fight to remain unmarried ended with her getting married, but she almost becomes sort of a advocate for not prison reform, but judicial reform. And so she is marched. She and John Mitchell remain close. If you all don't know, the Richmond Planet remains a popular paper. And as Dr. Lirely said, one of the things about the Richmond Planet are the illustrations and the pictures in them. And so Mitchell and her traveled throughout Virginia well into the 20th century, talking about how Black Southerners are being treated in courts. And she lives a totally different life than what she lived before the murder. So do the other women. One of the women was her mother and sister, and Mary Abernathy is the last one who is acquitted. But Mary Abernathy also goes on the lecture circuit and talks about talks about the trial. One of the last articles I find about Pokey Barnes is from a Democratic newspaper in Virginia that says Pokey Barnes is basically saying Pokey Barnes arrived in our city today and she was bombarded with fans. Like they couldn't get her out of the church. And so she becomes like a local hero for Black Virginians. The argument that I make in the paper is that Black women were central to the reform agenda, but it's also a part of this larger argument that I hope to make one day, that single Black women were altogether excluded from the histories of Civil War and post-Civil War narratives. They are, and this reform, what's happening to Pokey Barnes in the late 19th and early 20th century, as you said, Dr. Lirely, is this point when they stop facing scrutiny from white Freedmen's Bureau agents, white Union Army, and they start facing scrutiny from their community about getting married. And this comes through the reform agenda, or specifically Black reformers. I am concerned with white reformers, but I am more interested in what Black reformers thought of them, because I want to see that thread well into the 20th century of how single Black women are viewed. Eventually, as you all know, we get to the welfare queen and the woman with all of the kids and the moral depravity that she represents. And so I'm interested in how reformers saw her and how they stopped, how they tried to stop the population. The paper also ends with, I think, one of the most popular 20th century African-American activist, W.B. Du Bois, who does a study in Farmville, Virginia, and says that recycles the same theory of these local Black Virginians. And I'm trying to show that this is taken to a national level. This is no longer local Black Virginians who are concerned about single Black women, but it is now the mind of W.B. Du Bois, who calls these women in Farmville, Virginia, he just throws them under the bus. They just represent everything that is wrong with the lower classes of the race. As you pointed out, Dr. Lirely, this is just a paper. Well, the last portion of this study is just class conflict. Who is included in Black middle class and who is not included in Black middle class. And when African-American women or single African-American women are kicked out, they are never to return. And I would say even today into the Black middle class narrative. They are shunned from this idea. Family is the only sort of norm in African-American history. And largely, I say that this is why the Reconstruction narrative is so focused on marriage. It's so focused on people running to the altar, and it does not focus on those left out of the altar.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really good. Arlisha, can you expound on those class tensions that you just mentioned?
I think that it is just lower class women or lower the portions of lower middle. I'm telling y'all, you have to drink coffee. If you don't drink it, you are done for. Lower class African-American communities they represent everything that has to do with enslavement, right? In freedom, we no longer want to be associated with the things, whether it be immorality through sex or immorality through children out of wedlock. They see freedom as a way to reconstruct their image, right? And so unmarried women, and like Stan's paper, I include widowed women, divorced women, which are super interesting. It is just more than unmarried women. It is all these groups of women who were not in the marriage contract who were kicked out. And it remains that way. Like I believe that my argument is that it remains that way.
Thank you all. Now for the audience. Audience, you can put your questions in the Q&A. And it looks like we already have one from Angela Robbins, who thanks the panelists for their research, in particular, Jessica. And her question is, did you find small business owners among the freed women? And any info about freed women working for white women and operating small businesses?
Thank you for your question, Angela. No. That's my business for you women. Any info about? So I did find that one of the ways that formerly enslaved women sought to insulate themselves from labor exploitation, and this has been well documented in the secondary literature. To begin with, this, even in Jacqueline Jones's seminal text on Black women in labor after the Civil War through the early 20th century. The Black women certainly are trying to engage in laundering and huckstering and other forms of labor that enable them to distance themselves from the oversight of white employers, right? They are trying to achieve some sort of occupational autonomy that enables them to devote whatever time they want to their families, to have greater control over the amount of labor that they're expending, the number of hours they work per day, their wages and things of that nature. Yeah, so I would say that my work addresses that, but beyond that, it doesn't take a deep dive into women as entrepreneurs. But I really appreciate your question, because I think that you're suggesting to me that it might need to, right, to think about more fully the ways that entrepreneurship enables women to sort of straddle or balance this childcare and wage earning dilemma that they're posed with. So thank you for your question.
We don't have any other questions, but I was wondering if any of the panelists had questions for each other. It seems like your works really speak to each other in a lot of different ways, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to have a dialogue together about how your works might benefit from each other's insight. No questions for each other?
Well, I think this is something that Dr. Lirely brought up as well, and Arlisha was Dr. Norwood was also just talking about. I think that all of our papers in some ways talk to the pressures of from the African Americans themselves, right? To whether it's reform or whether it's to act in certain ways. And I wanted to ask Arlisha also, when she mentioned the racial elevation, right, sort of, and marriage being a central tenet of that, that one part of the reform agenda, some reformers said that this elevation could seek better treatment from whites, but also some had a genuine concern for the future of the race. And I wondered, with those sort of two tracks, probably many held simultaneously at the same time, did you find that those led themselves to different, arguments around Black women and Black women's marriage, or was it sort of towing the same line, the same recommendations?
Stan, thank you for that question. I found that although they had different tracks or ideologies, what was interesting is that they all wanted to get rid of the single Black women population. I inserted this. I wanted to be clear, because when I started this research, I assumed that racial elevation and racial uplift was about the perception of white Americans. But as I was reading, it becomes clear that they are concerned about the perception of white Americans, but they also believed that infant mortality rate is high, as Jessica proves, because of all of these things going on inside of the home. And they were going on inside of the home. So that is not false. And I wanted to show, or I wanted to be clear in the paper that, we always talk about racial elevation and racial uplift as, again, this external concept, but African Americans are genuinely concerned about the lower class of African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century, because they do believe that we will not make it for very long with these sorts of, with infant mortality rates this high, with poor diets, with unclean homes. This is all real things that I think are true today. We talk about eating the right diet to get to the next level. And so I wanted to show this genuine concern, because I started this research off thinking something completely different. And so, as history proves all the time, you are always wrong, and it's something totally different. And so I wanted to show that.
Thank you. Any others? Okay, well, we're almost just have 5 minutes left, and I want to thank you all for participating in this panel. I won't ask any questions of you, but thank you all for participating in this panel. And I guess you have about 5 minutes to refresh into the next session. Thank you to the audience as well. And I feel the panelists would be open to questions if you emailed them at their respective institutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.